So everyone, today we're here to talk about the protection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage, how that heritage has been protected in the past, what's happened to the protection of cultural heritage over time, and what ideas we might have, constructive ideas for how we might think about reinforcing that protection as we go forward. I think, as I'm sure this is a very live issue for many of you, probably more than for me in my day-to-day work, but I was struck just yesterday listening to a piece on the ABC's The World Today program about a particular area of Tasmanian cultural heritage, and I heard Rodney Dillon on that program talking about his concerns about how information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage is, how it's recorded, how it's assessed, and how those sites are treated. So it seems like it's very timely for us to be getting into that conversation through the research that Hilary's been working on. For those of you who don't know much about us at the Whitlam Institute, Gough Whitlam set us up with a pretty simple goal, which was to help try and build a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. And this work really falls very much firmly for us within the marching orders that he gave us. So we do policy research, trying to create a bridge between academia and policy spaces as much as we can. We're heavily involved in community engagement projects, primarily for the people of Western Sydney, but we also try to get out to the regions to have lectures and events out there. And we do a lot of work in the civics education space, trying to empower young Australians to participate in their democracy and in their world. This research that we're looking at today comes out of the E.G. Whitlam Research Fellowship, which was a gift from the University of Western Sydney to the Whitlam Institute on the death of Gough Whitlam. So through that fellowship, we're able to offer $30,000 a year to researchers who are looking at any issue that kind of evokes the Whitlam legacy, but that has a particular focus on looking at constructive policy impact that works towards the greater goal of making Australia a better country for everyone who lives here and everyone who engages with it. And I just wanted to say, Hilary, that from my perspective, your research on this topic is a really good example of trying to tie together the history and the way forward. So the idea from us is that today's seminar is about getting your feedback on Hilary's concept paper and learning from you about how far we've come so far with that research. And then we'll hopefully finalise the paper and take it forward in through whatever avenues and in whatever ways we can to try and advocate for positive change. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody in this room about the Whitlam legacy and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. We have a wonderful exhibition downstairs on the ground floor that really showcases some of the work that the Whitlam Institute was involved with. But obviously it extends from everything related to really the broadest policy of self-determination through to land rights and the Aboriginal Land Fund, the establishment of the National Estate, the Australian Heritage Commission. And I just wanted to evoke that very famous quote of Gough Whitlam's when he was talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander self-determination, when he said that all Australians are diminished while the Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation. And I think that we can still say very much the same thing about that today. Without being too rude, would you like to give us your own introduction then?
Oh, okay.
Feel free to embellish what we had on paper.
All right. Well, first of all, I'll confess I started my career as an archaeologist, working in southeastern Australia, mainly Victoria and Tasmania. I had a consulting firm for about 10 years based in Melbourne. And then I decided to go to Asia with my husband and lived in Hong Kong, Macau and Singapore, where I worked on heritage management and cultural tourism, and sometimes did projects for UNESCO, the United Nations World Tourism Organisation. So I sort of had two careers. The first one, I definitely was involved in some of the National Estate Grants program research, some sort of talking relationship with the Australian Heritage Commission, but not actually on staff. And also was known for organising a landmark conference on women in archaeology in 1991. So I've done sort of various odd things over the years, and now I'm back in Australia after 20 years in Asia, working at various universities. I was very pleased to see the E.G. Whitlam Fellowship offered because I had this topic in mind, and I've had it in mind for a number of years since seeing the Australian Heritage Strategy come up and what was in the State of Environment reports. And so I had some concerns about what was happening with Indigenous places. So it was a really good opportunity to follow that through.
We'd love to hear from you, so take your time and go ahead.
All right. First of all, I'd like to do my own acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and pay my respects to the elders past and present and everybody here. And from Gadigal, I think you said? Barraman. Okay. Okay, all right, we'll go with that one. Okay. And I would like to welcome members of the Western Sydney University Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Campus Advisory Group who are here today and have been helping me with the study. Fabulous people, thank you. So these are the issues I'm going to go through. Just going to do a very brief introduction, and then the study's sort of broken down into 7 themes. So as you can see it getting into theme 5, theme 6, you know you're getting close to the end. All right. And then I'll conclude it, and in your handout there's some issues for further discussion. Don't worry about them right away, but after lunch there may be some things we'll talk about. They're just there as a sort of a prompt. And I've also got some potential recommendations along with those in the handout. And I don't know, if we could come up with 5 hot points out of this that could, be taken up by decision makers, that would be really good too. But I'm open to hear anything you have to say about the consultation paper or my research. So, the study itself, I'd really like to say that it's a measure in trying to restart the conversation on national policy on Indigenous places, which seems to have kind of slowed down or stalled with trying to implement the Australian Heritage Strategy. And I'd like to do that by invoking the early days of national policy when, the very first things were done during Whitlam. So the legacy of the Whitlam government's promotion of the national estate concept is very important, because one of the things it concentrated, became important for it, was that there were Indigenous places of strong local significance, not just those of iconic national significance. So the study has been conducted through the Institute here, and it looked at 3 key questions. What was the Whitlam legacy? What are the gaps and problems that have emerged since? What sort of insights can be found from the legacy of for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their heritage places and international cultural heritage best practice? So that sort of came into it as well. So it has covered 45 years. And I thought it would be important to have a number of different outputs to try and deal with this. So there's the consultation paper, a possible online newspaper article and an academic article. So it's not just an academic exercise, this one. It's trying to do something that will induce some change. And there's also a seminar that's going to be given to the Sydney chapter of Australia ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, on the 14th of March. So the research itself, I should say a bit about the methodology very quickly. We encouraged as many different people from all the groups of stakeholders involved in the management of Australian Indigenous places as I could, particularly those working in private, public and not-for-profit sector. And we even got some people who were working there and were retired coming to talk to me in the study to share their views. And the online survey itself was actually very useful for that. So there were people all over Australia who were contacted or contacted me through the survey and wanting to see the draft consultation paper. In the end, this sort of boiled down to 20 in-depth interviews and over 40 online survey responses. And I then boiled all that down to 7 major themes that I said earlier. Of the people I talked to, at least a third were of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. And I also looked at some documentary stuff. I've brought a bit here to show you. You can have a bit of a reminiscence if you remember the Australian Heritage Commission, or you can be introduced to the sort of high-level publications they put out. So the major themes are, as you can see there, the underlying philosophy, key aspects, key achievements, benefits of the legacies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their places, and a sort of shift away from the Whitlam philosophy ethos as you go into the 90s and why that happened. The benefits of the changes that came from that, but also what has been discontinued or lost and what problems we still have. And also what people want to see change and what has been suggested as improvements from the interviews and the online survey. So these 7 themes are roughly chronological. However, I have given you a 4-page handout which has some better chronological stuff on it if you're a bit vague about what's been happening. Yeah, so if you just have a quick look at that, you could see that there are 6 main phases. Yeah, on the first page. Yeah, that's it. That's the one. Yep, that's it. And on the back of that, there's a big table. So it just, I just sort of want to put everything a bit more in context. So there's certain things that were factors or pivots or maybe just underlying influences that I've tried to include there, but there's probably a lot more too that you can't fit on one page. Yeah. So I think it'd be nice to, seeing we're in the Whitlam Institute, address some of that early history in a little bit of detail. So I hope this doesn't end up sounding a bit like a history lesson, but I'd like to go over this period from 1970 to 1975 to give you a bit of a basis for why things went in the direction they did and why the Australian Heritage Commission was set up in the way it was. So this theme covers the Australian use of the national estate concept, which originally came from overseas, principles underlying it, the respect that government had for Aboriginal and Indigenous heritage generally, and the 1974 Hope Inquiry report, which, if we could do something like that today, would be really interesting. And then that framed the Australian Heritage Commission Act, which was passed in 1975, and then you had the commission set up in 1976 later. So the concept of the national estate was initially made prominent by the US President John F. Kennedy, though I believe its actual genesis comes from Britain. There's a paper on that by Sharon Veal and Robert Freestone. It was adopted by the Honourable Gough Whitlam, ACQC, in 1970 in a speech on urban affairs. Although the idea from it originally, or the the idea to hang that as a concept for heritage came partly from Tom Uren, later the Minister for Department of Urban and Regional Development, DIRD, and a staffer, I think his name was Race Matthews. So those two sort of got together with Gough and said, there's this national estate concept. This could be really useful in trying to address community concerns about heritage and environment. And Whitlam himself believed that the Commonwealth should see itself as the curator, not the liquidator of the national estate. So there was a strong conservation element to it from the very beginning. In May 1973, Whitlam called for an inquiry into the national estate, which was headed by Justice Robert Hope. It included extensive consultation from around Australia and received submissions before reporting back to the government in April 1974. When the report was ready, Whitlam released it to the public, maintaining that his government was the first administration to commit to identify, conserve and protect the national estate. So this idea that trying to do something at the national level, yeah. He believed in turn that this could, looking back from 1993, I looked in a speech and he said that he believed it was probably the most far-sighted decision his government had made, and in relation to heritage and environment, that would be seen as not just important to the present electorate but also to future Australians. And if we look through the amazing things that have been saved from the 1970s onwards, this might be the case. Again, Veal and Freestone have also said that they saw it, the report, as being a symbolic high point on national engagement on cultural heritage. So that plus the philosophy was really important. So it is worth having a quick look at the Hope report and what was in it. So basically there was a rationale there for combining protection of all heritage classes under one umbrella. So that was Aboriginal, later Indigenous, historic and natural heritage, all in together, though the detailed consultation could occur separately. The report stated that the national state consists of a number of disparate interrelated components, but it should be managed with an overall policy. And it also recommended that there should be one body that could be put together to effectively promote the national estate as an all-embracing concept. There's also a quote that I was sent as part of the online survey that's interesting in this context. The person said, "The Hope Report 1974 recommends against burying the conservation machinery in the Department of Environment." And he refers to the page in the report where it says that. "I believe this was sage advice," end of quote. The section they're referring to cites examples from the US and UK about what to do and what not to do, and concluded that they've tried in a federal system in the US to weave the preservation of national heritage into a network of interdepartmental activities. Sorry to be so technical about this, but you'll see a reason for this later, okay? The Hope Report also saw a strong need for orchestration of all the bodies connected with the national estate. So that would be anyone dealing with forests that may have places in it, or areas that may have, like national parks that may have places as well, trying to all work with the new commission. So they also wanted it to be an administrative body which had an independent status, and that would be recognised by the states and Australian government departments. So achieving this was not always easy, and there were times of incredible contestation over heritage between different government departments. But back in the beginning, the Hope Report advised that the greatest possible measure of information on the working of the process must be made publicly available, perhaps foreshadowing some of the lack of transparency that we're seeing today. Maybe we should be going back to that sort of thing too, to have a more informed sort of policy generation process. So things need to be more transparent as to what's going on. So the Hope Report received 1,000 public submissions, around 1,000. And one of them argued very strongly, well, a couple of them did, for the new body to include lots of specialist expertise and be flexible in operation. And actually DIRD, the Department of Urban and Regional Development, went along with this. They thought that was a good idea. And it would also attract top quality staff to the new body. And they could also see that its role would become more and more important. The Commission would become a more weighty thing. So the model of the Commission itself was drawn from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in the US, and then adapted to local conditions. And in doing that, there was this thing called Section 30 in the Australian Heritage Commission Act, which took a lot of the powers that were outlined in the US one and actually made them a bit stronger in some ways and more sort of related to government agencies in relation to protecting heritage. So the Act was a bit influenced by the US, and then it was also trying to work with Australian conditions, what would be possible. So it was trying to have a comprehensive approach to a lot of things. And I'll move on a bit. Important for setting up the national estate, they needed information, and they needed to oversee background studies, either done in-house or using information from studies they commissioned outside. So great importance is this comprehensive national approach to identification of different natural and cultural elements. So they could start to build up this central database. And eventually they started to do all sorts of different kinds of studies. I'll talk in a bit more detail about that later, including thematic studies. They also were very keen to do work that would, would be very deep in the detail that wasn't, and to help with states and territories also do that as well. So sometimes there was a system of sort of matching funding, and that can get quite technical, but they were trying to follow what was already happening with the Universities Commission. Okay. So in doing that, finally, it was expected that the new body would be working with all these different agencies, trying to get research done, trying to get some public promotion of the national estate, and also providing leadership at the Commonwealth level. And then it was trying to address some of the international obligations. And Leanne said a little bit about this earlier, but it is interesting that in 1975, Whitlam also ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that states that all peoples have a right to self-determination, and that should, of course, extend to what happens to their heritage. And Whitlam himself observed in 1993, in constitutional and political terms, the responsibilities of the national government and the Parliament on heritage and environment issues are comparable to their responsibilities on human rights. So he's linked these two together very closely. Then the bill went through and the Heritage Commission was about to start during the last week or so of the Whitlam government. And unfortunately, they had one person for the commission, the chairman, David Yenkin, appointed, and then there was the dismissal, and it had to wait another year until Fraser brought it in. He didn't really change very much on the bill, and seemed to overlook the whole issue of Section 30. So what could have been a disaster with the whole thing being cancelled actually continued on more or less in the same way as Whitlam intended it. So by 1976, it started to move forward. Okay, and so will Willie. So just to explain a bit about what it is, the key aspects for those who may not remember it, it could be said that particularly by David Yenkin, who was the chair, that it wasn't really controlled as much or overseen as much by the minister of the day as the current arrangements are. And it was allowed to get on with its own business, basically. It could present a report to the minister at any time, and this is interesting. The minister would then have to table it in Parliament. He couldn't stick it on a shelf or, forget about it. It had to actually be tabled in Parliament within a certain number of days. And that's very different to the current situation with National Heritage Council. Accordingly, the department, which was now more easily titled Department of Environment and Heritage, is no longer DIRD, started to recognise that this thing was developing into something they couldn't control as much. And that caused some problems later that we'll get into. But it was also an interesting time in that it developed its ethos of things we want to keep, which had a resonance with all sorts of communities, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who wanted desperately to keep things that they saw as significant. Yeah. So by 1991, the register had 880 places, of which around 5,500 were Indigenous, and I think these were largely archaeological sites. However, all types of archaeological sites were included on it: ceremonial grounds, sacred sites, and contact sites such as the Macassan Wells, where Aborigines and Macassans sort of got to know each other over these water wells, and but not so much the contemporary ones like the female orphan school or the female factory, which have cultural values for stolen generations. That came much later. All right. It had no legal or binding powers over state or local agencies, though a section of its Act, the Section 30, empowered it and other Commonwealth agency to take no action that would have an adverse impact on listed places. But it had a lot of bluffing power because there was a sort of moral issue. If something was on the national estate, that must mean it's important somehow. So sometimes planning approvals would have to take it into account rather than just right over the top of it. Yeah, so it was growing in complexity and there were more issues for it to deal with. The Commission with its backup staff, it looked like the Commission would need more backup staff, so in November 1988 the government affirmed its position and it started to grow in size. And about this time it went up to about 50 people, many of whom had special technical expertise in heritage. And between 1989 and 1991, they went flat out and put another 800 places on the Register of the National Estate. So when it was really going hot. A handful of interviewees who had direct experience of it at the time said that there was a lot of relationship building with the Indigenous sector. So things started to move in that respect. And one interviewee observed, of the period up to the late 90s, it was independent in the sense that it could spend its money in the way that it felt was appropriate. It was a body that prided itself on its authority and its expertise and was what it was formed to do, be an expert body. It had experts there to do the tasks that required with its statutory role. So I'm not sure if it was like a CSIRO, but it was a kind of a body that could, if there was a big research question, it would find a way to deal with it, and it was also trying to help the states and territories up their game with what they were doing. One of the interviewees also made the point that if you drew up a national list of the top heritage experts around the world, quite a few, maybe in the top 20, would have come from Australia at that time. And it started to have an influence on what was happening at the international level. For instance, this issue of cultural landscapes became important when Uluru was reinscribed or had cultural values added to it on the World Heritage List. It originally had been inscribed with natural values, and then in the early 90s, the Heritage Commission and the people in Central Australia started to agitate to include the cultural values. And this actually changed the practice at the international level, and you'd see more emphasis on values-based assessment methodology, which is important for Australia because of its Indigenous past, and bringing in more about social significance. So at that time, it was starting to lead the world on some cultural heritage practice. And I actually have, if you want to just have a look while I'm talking, I'll hand around a few pamphlets so you can see a little bit more about what it was about. So nobody gets bored. Right? Yeah, just. So
I'll pass them all along.
Yeah, all right. So where are we? 12. Yeah. And it was doing some really interesting things in the sort of planning and land use management space. I went through some of the stuff on the regional forest assessment and the agreements. Yeah, and Dennis was involved in some of this work. Yeah. And they actually, if you look in your handout, you can see in the organisational chart, the handout is the 4-page thing, yeah, that's it. Yeah, good. I think on page 3, yeah, you can see what the Heritage Commission at its height also included some regional assessment, which a lot of that stuff was to do with trying to identify and protect heritage places in state forests down the eastern side of Australia. So I think there were 4 states were Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, I think. And these are still going this work is still going in regards to the regional forest agreements that you hear about occasionally. And they come up for renewal every 20 years. So a bunch of them are going to come up for renewal soon. And it's interesting to see whether they'll continue in the same way. They use the National Estate assessment values from the Register of the National Estate in terms of what was being protected. And it's still actually working like that, even though other things aren't. So I just thought I'd point that out. So they actually got that particular group of land use owners on side, but they had a bit more trouble with others, and there were very strong pro-development lobbyists, some of the mining people, some of the farmers who weren't terribly happy with this action to try and protect a number of these nationally important places. It seemed to get in the way of what they were doing. So there were often some really major conservation battles, a lot more with the historic and the natural heritage, but also sometimes with the Indigenous side of things. So overall, I'm just summarising what people said about it. The actual Australian Heritage Commission, they had people who responded to the online survey and who I talked to in interviews, thought it was the things that was doing were trying to do mostly good things. Occasionally he made some mistakes. They admired its independence and thought it was fantastic to have those resources at the national level and help with advice and things, basically. The Register of the National Estate was a little bit more problematic. It was the first, I suppose, attempt at something like that. Things have moved on, and they were moving on in the 90s with new legislation in the states and territories to protect things. So sometimes it was seen as useful and sometimes it wasn't. But there were some really positive comments about this thing of the local significance and how communities felt listened to about the things they thought were really important that they wanted to keep. The National Estate Grants Program, that's what the NEGP stands for, a lot of very positive comments about that because there's really nothing like it now. And we're beginning to feel its lack in certain areas. Like that's when I raised the thing about the climate change. How do we do something like that now? And it generated a lot of information, both to help with the Register of the National Estate, but also to help at the state and local levels with some of the planning and what they wanted to keep. So there was a complicated funding arrangement between the state and the Commonwealth with that. Sometimes the states would throw in some money. It really raised the level of things across the board. Okay, yes, so we keep going with that, Also, there was quite a bit of engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The people who worked in the Heritage Commission were viewed very positively. I heard a lot about that. But you could see there was a need to change things with the way the Section 30 powers were working. And I think in the consultation paper I also mentioned after 1984 you had this additional act, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act. And so there were also some things happening with that the Heritage Commissioner get dragged into. So just going on, the key achievements, well, as I said, it gave a foundation to a lot of the state registers, like the South Australian one. A lot of those sites that went on that came from National State Studies, and I think also in Tasmania. It also allowed access to independent technical advice and, as I said, improve heritage practice and facilitate better land use planning. Okay. And a lot of work happened, and there was one comment that this era saw action. There was a lot of things that happened, and It was kicked off initially in 1974-75 with a big injection of money, over 7 million, which somebody worked out for me would be in Australia, in current terms in Australian dollars, would be over $40 million to start things off with doing these research and finding out what people wanted with the studies. So it started off with that to get it going, and then it sort of was gradually starting to rise towards the end of 95, and then we have the shift away where it started to lower again. And the National Estate Grants Program was cut off in 1999, unfortunately. It was flexible enough to do really large studies, like this one, which helped, I suppose, with understanding what was around Melbourne in the early days. And it could also do, sure, all right. Things that were more targeted, like on tourism and protection of Aboriginal sites, pass that around too. There was also, I can't find it, but there was a rock art one that was still being used a lot today on rock art conservation. And even though this isn't Indigenous, you should see the quality of the work. This one was tracking the dragon, looking at Chinese sites. So that is an example of a thematic study, which was very high quality and has still got useful information today, particularly if you're looking at something like Chinese tourism in Australia. So we need these kind of things back again. We can have a look at that. And I like to see that in the Gough Whitlam oration by Noel Pearson, and he said, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And he was, what had Whitlam done for us? He had a list of things. And in there is the Australian Heritage Commission. So I think people really did recognise that it was one of the key legacies, and particularly, here we go. It allowed targeted funding. It ensured lots happened in the public policy space. And it started to push for all these, even historic places, to have Indigenous values recognised. And that's becoming more and more important. So just going on to what what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people thought of it all, I was able to contact some people who remember it, and also some people who've heard of it, and people who are having problems today and would love it to come back, and all sorts of things. And there was, some mixed views from people who remember. They would have liked the powers basically of Section 30 to be stronger. That's what I kept hearing. And sometimes there was more funding for the non-Indigenous stuff than they would have liked. They would like to see more coming to their places. But this thing of it being a foundation to start to bring recognition of Indigenous places as being valuable and something that should be kept alongside these other classes of heritage. And I particularly like that quote. Anyway, so it was starting to become of interest. And people also were very complimentary of the staff, and they did this special thing, which I'll also send around, where they had an Aboriginal liaison officer, an Aboriginal person who'd go to the communities and help them do their applications for the National Estate Grants Program, or just listen to what problems they had. And I think we kind of lost that contact. It sometimes happens at state level, but I don't see it happening with funding programs. So I'll just pass around this pamphlet that describes the sort of services they provide and mentions the Aboriginal liaison officer person. Okay. Yeah. So, what is that?
Hilary, can I ask, does that mean that these liaison officers were attached just for the purposes of assessing those?
Yeah, they're in the Indigenous section.
So how much of the staff were people of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander heritage?
Well, there was Chrissy Grant, who was the head most of the time, and so I'd say at least half.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
For that section. Yeah. Right, so then we sort of move on to what happened next and how we... Oh, okay, I've got a few quotes still, yeah. So these were people responding to me of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, and I think, okay, I've got to keep moving because otherwise we'll, So the period from 1992 onwards started to see things change for the Heritage Commission, and the Council of Australian Governments, which included the Commonwealth Government and all the state and territory governments, had some very critical meetings in 1992 and 1997. And the other issue was the Howard government coming in 96. The lobby groups started to have an impact and various other things started to happen. So with the Council of Australian Governments, they started to agitate towards a change in legislation, particularly of the Australian Heritage Commission Act, and to move towards the current legislation, though they were just talking about it at the time and putting together some agreements. But what it was a function of was this thing that was a kind of new federalism in the 1990s, and underlying that was the principle of subsidiarity, which means that there would be less direct oversight from the Commonwealth level and more responsibilities allocated at the state and territory level and lower down at the local level. So they're saying, all right guys, we've done this so far, you've got to take more responsibility. Now you have your legislation and your, heritage agencies and whatnot, and we'll just have a very indirect role in what's going on. And it was, it's something, if you want to do sustainable development with grassroots, it would sound like quite a good idea, but you've also got to have the quality at that level too. And sometimes, standards were different. There was supposed to be a way of standardising the practice, and that was talked about a lot. I mean, look at this. Okay, yes. These things, lots of talk went on, as you know. Yeah, so the Heritage Commission tried to manage the process and hopefully construct something that would be a good new step. But in the end, it was eventually sort of abolished, and it meant that new legislation came in, and that was applied also to the natural and historic environment. And I talk about that quite a bit in the consultation paper, about what happened with that. So we see this whole thing starting to happen from 2003 on, with the Heritage Commission being abolished, the Australian Heritage Council coming in with its new list, which had to start from scratch with a whole lot of new places, all very complexly assessed. There's deep assessment process to get on this new list. And the Register of the National Estate sort of closed off eventually as a sort of archive. You can still go in there and look at it, but it's not used and updated in the same way that it was. And then eventually the Productivity Commission said that, oh, this stuff's getting in the way of everything. Can we minimise heritage listings? It actually does say something about that in there, yeah. So views on the shift, we saw a range of views depending on who you talk to, and I did talk to the head of one heritage agency who was very positive about it. He thought that giving his state agency more say in things did work more smoothly. So we do have that at one end of the continuum. At the other end is a lot of dissatisfaction and, you know, things like this current issue in Tasmania. Even though it is a World Heritage Area, it does bring in some of the concerns about how the state agency is managing that, you know. So, yeah, it is a bit of a mixed blessing what's happened. Yeah, so sometimes there's a clash also on the level of significance, and you do have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people saying everything's important to them, and how can we come up with something for the National Heritage List? How can we agree to somebody else's thing being more important than ours? So these sort of issues we may have to talk a bit more about later as in regard to how you construct a national register that gives meaning to a lot of these different disparate kinds of places of things we want to keep. Yeah. So the good things that were happening through the transition period and later were, I think, these Indigenous protection areas. Currently, I think they cover about 40% of state reserves. It's a massive amount of land that now has direct Indigenous control and is getting funding from the Commonwealth Government for land care. There also have been national as well as state ranger programs that are starting to happen or have been happening for quite a while. But I haven't heard much about what the career paths are. Do you become a senior ranger? What happens after that? Could you do a degree at university? Maybe it needs to be developed further, that sort of thing. But they are good things that are happening. There seems to be a bit of a critique about whether you can get targeted funding for cultural places as against looking after the land, like doing burning and managing water and stuff. So maybe that needs to be looked at a bit more too. The problem areas, there was that list in the thing, in the concept paper, and it seemed to boil down to problems with people were having with a sort of vacuum in the national leadership. The jurisdiction problems are still not sure what each of the states should be doing, and sometimes there was overlap and problems with the governments and issues with that. So we're basically seeing some fragmentation at the top level too. And if you talk, you've got the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet looking after those IPAs, the Indigenous Protection Areas and Ranger Programs, and then over in Department of Environment and Energy, you've got World Heritage, National Heritage List, the Commonwealth Heritage List, other stuff like that. And then the forests are actually over in the Department of Primary Industry and Agriculture. So it's, we need to drag these back together somehow. So these are some of the quotes that people have given on this, and they do recognise you can't go back to the Australian Heritage Commission days, but there may be, as I've given you, an option for some sort of independent centralised body on national heritage to provide detailed advice and give Indigenous communities a voice. You know, so it does fit well with what was being said about Ullaru's statement of the heart. You need more of a voice in your policy, really. Yeah. And this is it. Where is the voice for cultural heritage generally? I see, you know, the natural heritage has a very strong voice, and, you know, things like Adani or the fish kills or all these sort of things you hear from, you know, the natural heritage advocacy groups very strongly. And I'm not really sure, either with historic or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage, if there's a unified voice pushing for stuff. Yeah, so there's a little bit of an issue. What could happen in, you know, the case of these big picture things? And this is a kind of a scary thing, that you could have massive impacts from climate change on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander places. And we just don't know how bad it's going to be. The research is not being done. Yeah, yeah. Right? Yeah. And then this thing that got the media's interest was a couple of interviewees who live in Canberra remember after 2013 when the department shrank. The department took a lot of the stuff from the Australian Heritage Commission, that's the Department of Environment, and it got shrunk further, the resources were reduced, and then some really valuable reference data and research information was chucked out, and it was boxes and boxes of things, metres and metres, of library shelf space that was just, when they couldn't find a home for it easily, I mean, you know, ideally it should have gone to the states and territories if they didn't want it at the national level, but they didn't even want to spend the money on that, and it went to the tip with the covers being torn off. So you saw the table earlier of all the millions of dollars spent on the National State Grants Program. Well, imagine a lot of those reports, the hard copies are gone, unless they're already in a state library somewhere, or they managed to keep some in a little nook in the Department of Environment. Where are they? It was just this wonderful centralised resource. And this was even before they had the chance to digitise them. They could have digitalised them or something, you know. Anyway. So there were some people who were very angry about that who talked to me. Now what can we do? These are the areas that came up, and they're in the concept paper as well, as being where some action needs to happen. And the key thing of trying to get some targeted funding back to looking after Indigenous places. Oh, geez, I better go on a bit more. Right. And people were saying, here's some quotes from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So you can see there is a theme running through this: more independence, more information, more involvement. Yeah. Right. These are quotes from a mix of Indigenous and non... Anyway, this is quotes that are trying to give us a bit of a heads up on what might work. I'm not saying, I'm not trying to prejudice this discussion, but there are some interesting ideas in there. Yeah.
Hilary, it might be a simple question, but was the Commission an independent statutory authority under legislation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that would be part of these
proposals
in terms of independence.
Yeah. What do you want to go with that model again?
Yeah.
Yeah. Indeed. So I think his legacy extended to recognising Indigenous places is important, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture is important, and the fact that self-determination is important in its care, so people can have a say. I think these instruments that came out of the 1970s are really interesting, and some aspects of them still might be worth reviving in some way, maybe. Not the whole thing, probably. But it was very progressive for its time. And this thing, just going back to this again and again, because I'm not hearing this at the Commonwealth level. I would really like to see someone be more of a champion for heritage, including particularly Indigenous heritage. It seems to be very quiet out there. And this thing of curation, not liquidation, you know. So, right. So basically, a bit of a call to action. I think we now start to need to make a bit more noise. I hope the concept paper can generate some discussion. Is this principle of subsidiarity, is it working as well as it could? Could it work better? Do we need something new? What is the national conversation of heritage? Do we need another Hope-style inquiry to investigate this? That was a really fantastic piece of work, I think. I hope the little bit that I've done might be useful in terms of getting things going, and I still want my 5 hot points. Okay, thank you, everyone.
So we've got 10 minutes before we were going to break and have some sandwiches. It was great to have this presentation, but I wondered in this 10 minutes, Hilary, whether you could maybe talk us through the 4 options you put forward in your concept paper as a way forward. I noticed that, I'm not sure what, on page 17 of your paper, you set out 4 different options for the way forward, and then on page 18 and 19, you work through those options in some detail in terms of what would be required in terms of administration, leadership, jurisdictional arrangements, recognition and protection, and research. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Because that's what we should try and focus on discussing.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, I did the table because I thought that would be a bit easier to imagine this sort of very abstract sort of policy thing in practice, because these are just the sort of underlying things that are coming out.
Could you maybe summarise the 4 options?
Yeah, well, it's like again, at one end you are mindful that small changes could still be good. So I tried to give an option where if you even don't have a great amount of resources, you could start to do something. But the status quo is number 1, I think, yeah. So with a bit more resourcing and, you know, undertaking more of the promises that have been made, particularly in the Australian Heritage Strategy, you could undertake option 2. But I think from option 2 onwards, more engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is really important. I mean, as you can see in the Tasmanian example, something has gone wrong there, and this is what we're getting with the status quo. And if you're trying to move towards something a bit like the Heritage Commission, maybe option 3, because I'm talking about reintegrating all the types of heritage at the national level in one body. But again, aware that, you know, things move very slowly, it might be difficult to get that as a statutory body, I'm not sure. But at the moment, it seems like it's spread all over the place, and yeah, it should have its own minister again at least, and not be mixed in with heritage or primary industry or something else, yeah. that would actually be really good for the ranger program and the IPAs, because then you could have access to more targeted funding and expertise that will help with that develop a bit more. So, and there are some good things in the Australian Heritage Strategy that will help with that if they were fully implemented, because at the moment it's just a very bare framework, and more things have to be sort of developed from it.
All right.
So the final one is the independent one, with a lot more bells and whistles. If there was some serious money put into the database, all that sort of thing, and some close involvement of people from Indigenous communities and also experts who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in there. Now that would be, in my opinion, the ultimate, but I'm not sure if we're here to talk about workable policy. Can we find some way to get there, and what are the mechanisms that people see as important? I mean, that's just my view. What would be really useful at the national level? We may not need something that complicated. Yeah.
If people have a moment to just have a look through those 4 options, it'd be great to get your feedback on what you think is what's important in those options and what's viable, I suppose, politically and practically possible from those options too. So thank you very much, Hilary, again, for all that hard work.